We now come to the backbench motion on the effectiveness of Magnitsky-Style Sanctions for serious human rights abuses. And I call Sir Iain Duncan-Smith, who will speak for around 15 minutes. Sir Iain Duncan-Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I rise to move the motion standing in my name, supported by 17 honourable and right honourable members across the House. As chair of the all-party parliamentary group on Magnitsky sanctions and reparations, I welcome the advent of the growing use of Magnitsky sanctions as a major development in accountability for human rights abuse and corruption. These sanctions are named after Sergei Magnitsky, a tax advisor killed in a Russian prison after exposing fraud by the Russian government officials. Magnitsky sanctions freeze perpetrators' assets and stop them from travelling internationally, and they are now used by the UK, US, EU and Canada, together representing over one-third of global GDP. In the UK, Magnitsky sanctions stop perpetrators from accessing London, the world's second largest financial centre and the world's largest luxury property market. Sanctions are most effective when the various jurisdictions, of course, work together and with close perpetrators off from financial markets, so driving them away. Looking at the comparative picture, though, of the US has sanctioned 608 individuals and entities under its Magnitsky-style regime, though 20 have been delisted. 17 of those designations, Madam Deputy Speaker, related to Russia, with one since delisted. 34 against China, 6 against UAE for corruption. By contrast, this is the point I really want to make, since introducing Magnitsky-style sanctions in the bill, the Act that was passed in 2020, the UK has imposed 164 designations under its global human rights regime and 65 under the global anti-corruption regime, a total of 229 Magnitsky-style designations. Of these, 60 relate to Russia, 8 to China, and none to the UAE. And of course, the UK and the EU... I will indeed.
I apologise for intervening on him so early, but he did mention Russia several times. He'll be aware there's been much talk about ceasefires, but there is no sign of one as yet, because Putin still thinks he's winning in Ukraine. Would he agree with me that if we really want to compel Putin to stop killing Ukrainians, we need to increase sanctions on the Russian government, particularly on their hydrocarbons, and that means not just ourselves in Europe, but also further sanctions from the United States?
I agree with him, absolutely. I mean, we have a tool. We have a tool here that can be used to drive those who act badly and act, in this particular case, involved with a country that is invading a democratic state and its neighbour illegally. So we should use this ability to sanction and to increase the sanctions dramatically on those involved in this. And I know colleagues across the floor will be raising this issue later, but they'll take note of what my right honourable friend has said. So the UK and the US have imposed extensive additional sanctions on Russian individuals and entities under the Russian-specific sanctions regime. However, those regimes use broader designations, and my honourable friend will want to take note of this particular one. They use broader designation grounds, and crucially, they do not usually acknowledge an individual's direct involvement in human rights abuses in Ukraine or elsewhere. That distinction matters, and it should be rectified by the UK government. It is precisely the symbolic and moral force of Magnitsky sanctions to name perpetrators and link consequences directly to human rights abuses, and which sets them apart. In sheer volume, the contrast is stark. The US has imposed well over 5,000 such Russia-related non-Magnitsky designations, and the UK around 2,900. Yet despite this scale, the absence of explicit human rights attribution in most cases in these regimes means an important opportunity for accountability is being missed. As a mechanism in government's foreign policy toolkit, Magnitsky sanctions are hugely potential. However, important gaps remain in the implementation of Magnitsky sanctions, raising serious concerns about their overall effectiveness. There is no publicly available information on the number of Magnitsky sanctions evidence dossiers received by the UK Foreign Office. However, based on estimates since the inception of the UK's global human rights sanctions regulations in 2020, the FCDO receives on average around 2 or 3 dossiers of evidence per month from civil society organisations, often identifying between 3 to 15 individuals or entities alleged to be implicated in human rights violations. This means that since July 2020, the FCDO has received evidence on anywhere between 360 and 3,000 alleged perpetrators of serious human rights violations. In stark contrast, only 229 individuals and entities have been sanctioned under the global human rights regime and global anti-corruption regime to date. The limited number of Magnitsky sanctions imposed undermines their effectiveness. Designations tend to overlook broader command structures, instead focusing on isolated actors, excluding key backers or enablers, and failing to adopt when sanctioned entities rebrand. For example, Chen Xi is one of the many leaders of a scam of cell networks with bases in Southeast Asia, trafficking and torturing vulnerable individuals to compel them to scam citizens here in the UK and abroad. While news that the UK and US sanctioned some of those responsible is always welcome, those sanctions failed to target Cambodian government figures who are themselves implicated in the practice or who turn a blind eye to those violations.
With my right honourable friend,
I will.
I'm most grateful. I do congratulate him on obtaining this debate and for highlighting how these Magnitsky sanctions could be used more effectively. But could you explain to the House, and for my benefit, if one applies sanctions to some foreign leader or dictator or some person who is in a completely different jurisdiction, what effect does the sanction actually have? And how can it be made to bite on the interests of that person so that the sanctions are actually felt by that person?
Well, it has, I think, 2 effects, really. Number one, anything to do with any finance, moment or movements or visitations to the United Kingdom are immediately ruled out, and that seizure can take place of those financial entities. The second bit of it is it also influences other countries to do the same, and America may work with us on that as well. The 2 greatest financial markets are then shut to an individual who may be part of a government, and thus makes it highly difficult for them to operate and come and enjoy themselves as well, because a lot of that is done. And my answer to that means that they become pariahs internationally. Now that has a huge effect because it influences what others near them will do when they realise they're about to lose their access to very important areas, cities and financial markets. So it's already shown to have had a massive knock-on effect with others as well. I give way, honourable friend.
Would my right honourable friend explain to the House who it is who actually does the research that leads to the people being identified for sanctioning, and whether there's resistance in such places as the City of London that no doubt could make enormous financial profits from having illicit money deposited there, whether they are incentivised to turn a blind eye when attempts are made to camouflage the real sources of the dirty money flowing in.
There are many groups that are doing this at the moment. Some of them private and voluntary organisations, but the Foreign Office itself is meant to be doing this kind of research. I'm a bit struck by the fact that they don't always check everybody's backgrounds, but the reality is this has to be much more intense, and we must start going after these people. The City of London had got a bad reputation as a result for getting money which was dirty money coming into it. A lot of that has stopped now as a result of the Russian sanctions, but more importantly, individual sanctions also help end this. And we need to be much more particular about where this money is coming from and how, and who are the individuals that are behind the use of this money. So he is quite right about that. Well, I just say that if I keep giving way the whole time, what I'm going to end up with is losing time. But I'm going to give way.
I thank the right honourable member for giving way, and he's right to bring this forward. 229 designated by the United Kingdom, 3,000 Russians designated after the invasion of Ukraine. However, weak enforcement risks hauling out this regime. To date, no fines have been imposed for breaches of the UK's Magnitsky-Style sanctions. If this House is serious about protecting life and dignity. We must ensure these tools are used consistently and enforced credibly. I'm often reminded of the example of Jesus Christ, the greatest leader yet the greatest servant. He protected lives by giving his own. We as leaders should echo his example by diligently helping those who cannot help themselves. Thank you.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, of course, and the importance of this is getting justice and making sure that others who would be tempted to go down this road realise that there are going to be real penalties to pay. I'll give way to the gentleman.
My right honourable friend for securing today's important debate on Magnitsky-Style sanctions for serious human rights abuses, because there are numerous ways that sanctioned individuals have attempted to evade UK authorities, in particular when it comes to cryptocurrencies. So does he agree with me that coordination with our international allies, as well as being at the cutting edge of technology, are key to ensuring that these increasingly evasive individuals are brought to heel?
He is absolutely right, and that is the whole point of today's debate. My feeling here is this government and even the last government have, to a degree, dragged their feet over this. And I often say to the Minister, who I know very well, and we have debated with each other endlessly, I always say to him, it seems not to matter who is in government, but the Foreign Office still retains its reluctance over many of the sanctions. Now, he will deny that, of course, because that's what his job is to do. But I have to tell him that I see him as a very decent individual, and he must know in his heart of hearts that there is more that we could do. And I'll leave that for the moment until he has a chance to finish. Well, very quickly, I will.
Very quickly. I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Would he agree with me? There is a perception in my constituent and across the country of consumers when they go for a mortgage or when they're buying something that is expensive, like cars, that the money laundering checks on individual consumers seem to be more stringent than on these millionaire, billionaire foreign investors that are investing in the City of London.
Of course there are, and that is the whole point about the debate today, is to ensure that we know where the money comes from, we know how it is gained, and the individuals themselves must pay a penalty if they are involved in what is illegal or inhuman. All of those matters can be picked out by the Magnitsky sanctions, and that's the key point I would make. I mentioned Myanmar earlier, and I do want to make some progress, but I have to say, additionally, despite historically leading on sanctions against Myanmar's military junta in its role of the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity against Myanmar's civilian populations after the 2021 coup, the UK has, however, failed to target the State Security and Peace Commission, the military successor to the UK sanctioned State Administration Council. Without additional sanctions, the State Security and Peace Commission, which was established in an attempt for the military to rebrand itself and rebuild financial ties with international partners, has effectively succeeded in its mission, which is exactly how we should have been tackling it through the sanctions that are available to us, and we haven't. And finally, last month in this area, the UK placed sanctions on 4 senior commanders of Sudan's Parliamentary Rapid Support Forces suspected of involvement in heinous violence against civilians in the city of El Fisher. However, no action was taken against their key military and diplomatic backer, the United Arab Emirates, or their chief commander. This highlighted a broader, troubling trend. Only a fraction of Magnitsky sanctions to date have ever been applied by the UK government on perpetrators from countries considered strategic allies of the United Kingdom. And that is a very important point to make, because it has an awful lot to do with the politics of this. And as reported by Redress, several of the most notorious human rights abusers and corrupt actors, including the Iran, Nigeria, Sudan, China, Eritrea, the UAE and Egypt, and we've mentioned Russia as well, who have not been sanctioned by the UK, I will now come to some examples of individuals and contexts who remain unsanctioned despite overwhelming evidence of their involvement in corruption and serious human rights issues. I want to deal now with China. Well, the UK imposed sanctions on 4 individuals and one entity involved in China's violent repression of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang in 2021, it never acted on detailed evidence received from human rights organisations. Redress, I know, because I've seen the evidence, previously submitted it to the FCDO calling for targeted sanctions on the following individuals and entities for their involvement in serious human rights violations in Xinjiang. Persons recommended for designations, all of the following, are sanctioned by the US. Sanctioned by the US, our ally, not by the UK. Chen Quanguo, Party Secretary of the Xinjiang Chinese Communist Party, the key person to drive that policy of genocide. Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps. Sun Jinlong, former political commissioner of the ex-PCC. He was sanctioned by the US on the 31st of July 2020. Pen Juanyi, Deputy Party Secretary and Commander of the ex-PCC, sanctioned by the US on the 31st of July 2020. And Huo Linjun, former leader of the PSP, sanctioned by the US on the 9th of July in 2020. Now, as somebody sanctioned by the Chinese government myself, and dare I say it, the Deputy Speaker also sanctioned for us raising these issues at the time about Xinjiang, that is an omission, a major omission, because these are the key people going almost close to President Xi himself, who, when sanctioned, will really feel it, because they're locked out of America, but they're not out of us. And so will the Minister, I hope, outline what steps the FCDO will take to ensure that sanctions are consistently applied to all actors in human rights abuses and corruption. Very briefly, if I could. I need.
Why isn't there any transatlantic cooperation on this? What does he think the cause of that lack of cooperation is?
I really don't know the answer to that question. All I can say to him is that we act individually and we're supposed to cooperate, but it doesn't always work. And you've seen just from the Chinese, but other as well, where America leads the way and we half follow or not follow at all. And my concern is we don't champion this in the way that we could and should as an upholder of human rights and of freedom. This country has a huge record and we need to use it much more. I'm not the only member of this House to have raised concerns about the relationship between the government of the United Arab Emirates and the activities of the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan. What is going on in Sudan, we know, is brutal, bloody, and huge, even comparison to things like Gaza. It is an astonishing abuse of human rights and of the value of life. The RSF are responsible for brutal murders, rapes, attacks on hospitals, and significant numbers of killings. And yet this organisation has been supported heavily by the UAE. It is said that without the support of the UAE, there would not now be this major war going on in Sudan. And there are really big questions to be asked along this. Without those arms shipments and other supports, there is not going to be the fighting and the terrible consequences that we see. So I wish to draw the attention of the Minister to reporting by the New York Times in June of last year, citing US intelligence sources that have references to the involvement of Sheikh Mansour bin Zayed Al Nahyan, the Deputy President of the UAE, in coordination with the RSF and in his role as chair of two charities funding hospitals in Chad that have allegedly been used in the distribution of weapons to the RSF. The investigation further reports that the US envoy to Sudan confronted Sheikh Mansour personally in 2024 about his support for General Hamdan of the RSF. As the ultimate owner of Manchester City Football Club, Sheikh Mansour is possibly the most high-profile UAE investor in the UK economy. As the ultimate owner, therefore, I ask the question, what are we going to be doing about that? That is a signal and serious problem for us. So can I ask the Minister to confirm whether he has the appalling crimes of the RSF, which fall squarely under the purview of the Global Human Rights Sanctions Scheme, whether the Department has carried out in full assessment of whether representatives of the UAE government may meet the criteria for sanctioning, given the significant role the UAE has alleged to play in support of the RSF, and given the substantial influence of the UAE on investments in the UK economy and public life. If this has not been carried out, will the Minister respond about whether that is their intention? Individuals arbitrarily detained abroad are particularly vulnerable to torture, ill treatment and other serious human rights violations from the moment they are detained. The government's own figures show in 2024 the FCDO received 186 new allegations of torture and mistreatment from British nationals overseas. Arbitrary detention, related human rights abuses have long-lasting effects on those who experience them. Following release, survivors must bear the physical, psychological and socio-economic toll of their captivity. This makes all the more concerning that the list of British nationals currently subject to arbitrary detention abroad is long, and I'm going to read out the names. It includes Jagtar Singh Johal, Ryan Cornelius, whose family are with us today in the gallery, Jimmy Lai, Namda Kanu, Christian James Michel, Matthew Alexander Pascoe, Ram Shahib Ahmad Zone Al-Rifa, Charles Ridley and Merin Roof, Craig and Lindsay Foreman, and Ahmed Al-Douche. I want to focus on two, though, particular of those to exemplify the FCDO's reluctance to use Magnitsky sanctions to challenge arbitrary detention. First is Ron Cornelius, and then secondly, Jimmy Lai. In the case of Ron Cornelius, that underscores the UK government's ongoing failure, I believe, and I have to say, its predecessor, effectively employing Magnitsky sanctions to deter and punish those responsible for arbitrarily detaining and mistreating UK nationals, is that, of course, of Ron Cornelius. Ron Cornelius has been arbitrarily detained, and I want to mention also the honourable member for Macclesfield, who has raised this issue on a number of occasions, and congratulate him for his support for the family. Ron Cornelius has been arbitrarily detained in Dubai for over 17 years. This is also applied to his business partner, Charles Ridley. But I want to focus on Ron Cornelius. Unlike the case of Vladimir Kara-Murza, his plight has been met with deafening silence. This is despite well-documented evidence of an unfair trial and inhumane treatment that has been meted out to him. In addition, his detention has been found arbitrary by the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. His original sentence of 10 years was extended by 20 years at the behest of the Dubai Islamic Bank, who used Ran's imprisonment as leverage to seize his assets, rendering his family essentially homeless. The FCDO has been reluctant to engage fully with the detail of Ran's case from the very beginning. Even now, Ran's family, who are with us, as I said earlier, in the public gallery, are reportedly forced to set out the basic facts of his case at every single meeting with the FCDO or ministerial meeting, and yet it's fully known to them. Despite repeated calls from Ryan's family and from MPs for sanctions against Dubai officials, the UK government has taken no action. Not a single individual has been sanctioned for their role in this case. So I would ask and urge the Minister to look to impose targeted Magnitsky sanctions on those responsible for Mr. Cornelius' arbitrary detention and asset seizure. And I'm going to list just 8 people who are involved in the board of the Dubai Bank. His Excellency Mohamed Al-Shabani, Yanya Saeed Ahmed Nassar Luta, Vice Chairman of the Board of Directors, Hamad Abdullah Rashid Obad Al-Shamsi, who is a board member, Ahmed Mohammed Said bin Hamidin, again the same, Abdul Aziz Ahmed Rama Mohammed Al-Muhari, Dr. Hamad Bouamin, Javier Marin Romano, Bada Said Abdullah Harib, and Dr. Yidim Goga. These people are all involved in this, and I offer up their names for the government to think carefully about taking action. Unfortunately, in his case, Ryan's case, it does appear to me to be a clear example of economic interest taking precedence over human rights, largely because the UAE is such a major financial investor and trading partner. I'm afraid this double standard is not limited to Ryan's case. India, another country of the recent trade deal, continues to hold a British citizen in arbitrary detention without consequences. Jagtar Singh Johal from Dumbarton, Scotland, was violently arrested in 2017 while in India to get married, being tortured and endured 8 years of detention. And the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has ruled, and I quote, lacks legal basis and is arbitrary. After lots of hearings, hundreds of them, prosecutors in India have failed to produce credible evidence against Jagtar, and the UK The UK must now use every diplomatic lever to bring Jagtar home. I want to return finally to the case of Jimmy Lai. The time has come, surely, for the UK to wield its sanctions authority against the officials responsible for repression in Hong Kong. Jimmy Lai's guilty conviction for, quotes, foreign collusion and sedition on December the 15th, which paves the way for Hong Kong's courts to sentence the 78-year-old British citizen to life imprisonment, is the final straw. Beijing has trashed the Sino-British Declaration, crushed the freedoms it promised Hong Kongers and the world, and imprisoned nearly 2,000 political prisoners, including Jimmy Lai. I have long called for the government to hold the Hong Kong authorities to account for their persecution of the pro-democracy campaigners, who is guilty only for performing his duties as a publisher of Hong Kong's Apple Daily newspaper by speaking to diplomats and others overseas officials. Yet not a single Hong Kong individual is named in the UK sanctions list, which sets out all the people, entities and vessels sanctioned by Britain. In comparison, the US has sanctioned 11 officials from the top of Hong Kong's administration downwards. How is it that this country, which used to administer and run Hong Kong, has not sanctioned a single person in that process? And the three judges responsible for Jimmy Lai's outrageous guilty verdict, Esther To, Alex Lee and Susana de Almeida Remeros, two of whom were called to the bar in London, should be immediate targets, as well as the prosecutors Maggie Yang, Anthony Chow, Ivan Chung, Crystal Chan and Un Ka Yo. Despite the clear role Magnitsky sanctions could play in these cases, the government does not treat them as a core foreign policy tool for protecting British citizens abroad. They should not be reserved for politically convenient situations, but applied consistently, in particular when we have economic leverage over the perpetrating state. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture has formally recommended the use of Magnitsky sanctions to deter state hostage-taking, and survivors themselves have repeatedly called for their use. I say again to the Minister, I will listen very carefully to what he has to say. I think the House does want to get a sense of where the government is moving on this, whether they are intending to increase and speed up the level of those sanctions, and if they do so, they will receive, of course, the support of myself, but also of this side of the House, I believe. These are important moments, and this debate is important. So I want to conclude very briefly. When this House passed the Magnitsky Act, we did so in good faith. This singular tool would help us in the fight against the abuses of powerful people, particularly in the defence of British citizens wrongly detained and without the ability to defend themselves. Powerful people's control over others who have no redress and have no hope for their future. With the rise of totalitarian states and their satellites who threaten our very belief in freedom and due process, who are tearing apart what we call the international rules-based order, such as China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, this facility is needed more than ever. Its use is to deter others as much as to punish those who have acted without the law, and such action should be coordinated amongst our allies. This House is to hold the government to account. That's what our task is. And that is what this debate today is all about. If we do not speak for those languishing under control of others and the power of powerful states, then who will? This House has to hold the government to account. That's what the debate there is today. And I say to the government simply, this is not party pre, this is not personal, but this is really an idea that originated here, in this place, the idea of freedom, freedom of the individual, and their protections under the law. And for those who carry out the most heinous crimes, there has to be some kind of sanction. The Magnitsky sanction is the best tool that we've got. We should surely use it, and use it well, and make sure that those out there realise if they get up to these most disgusting and debilitating acts that they are carrying out, then they will face a consequence, and that consequence will last as long as they do. Thank you.
The question is as on the order paper. Lloyd Hatton.
Thank you, Madam
Deputy Speaker. And let me begin by thanking the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green for securing this important and timely debate. I want to pay tribute briefly to the persistence that he has shown in campaigning on this issue over many years, and for his work in this place helping make and win the argument for deploying Magnitsky-Style sanctions. I'd like to start by welcoming 3 successes by the government regarding our sanctions regime, namely decisive action against Putin's regime, action against people smuggling gangsters, and action against kleptocrats the world over. This government has shown that it is prepared to take bold and decisive use of sanctions to crack down on serious human rights abuses, corruption and breaches of international law. Firstly, I welcome the government's sustained tough action against the Kremlin, introducing the largest package of sanctions since the early days of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. I firmly believe that we must never again in this country act as a safe haven for Russian dirty money. And this city of London must never again be seen to be a secure and out-of-the-way piggy bank for Putin's cronies to stash their wealth. It is only right that we continue to expose and disrupt every enabler of Russia's war machine, which has been terrorising the Ukrainian people for close to 4 years now. And this must include ramping up the pressure on Putin's energy revenues. The government's sanctions measures have also gone a long way towards sinking Russia's shadow fleet, which we all know is a vital source of funding for Putin's war in Ukraine. Since the start of the invasion, Russian oil companies have established a shadow fleet of cargo ships charged with transporting sanctioned crude oil to third countries. These vessels are usually owned by anonymous shell companies to shield the ships from scrutiny and from sanctions. This fleet is then used to perform illegal ship-to-ship oil transfers at sea, making it much more difficult to monitor the final destination of Russian crude oil. This decaying and dangerous shadow fleet, of course, risks oil spills that could then cause damage on our shores here in the UK. Spills which I should remind this House that the British taxpayer would be liable to clean up. These sanctions designations brought forward by the government mean that a total of around 545 ships have been sanctioned by the UK. Almost half the Russian shadow fleet's overall capacity has been forced off the seas by sanctions by the UK and our partners, which with many of these ships now left dead in the water. Happily.
In support of what he's saying, does he agree that it is significant how important even a single ship of this fleet is to the Russian authorities, that in desperation yesterday, in a final attempt to stop it being seized, they actually allowed the Russian flag to be put on one of these vessels in the hope that that would deter the Americans from gaining control of it. Fortunately, it didn't.
I agree with the Honourable Gentleman's remarks, and I think the government's action and the previous government's actions to tackle the shadow fleet are starting to bite. We all know that these measures are hitting the Kremlin war machine, and they will slash the revenues that Putin desperately relies upon to continue to wage war in Ukraine. Secondly, I welcome sanctions against organised criminal gangs that are currently perpetrating the vile trade of people smuggling. This action by the government is a world first that targets ringleaders, key intermediaries and the suppliers of people smuggling equipment. I know that these sanctions will help to disrupt the flow of money and materials, including freezing property, bank accounts and other assets, and they will also help to disrupt a range of different activities, from supplying small boats for smuggling to sourcing fake passports, perhaps middlemen facilitating illicit financial payments, people smuggling via lorries and small boats, and of course sanctioning the very gang leaders themselves. We know that the people smuggling gangs operating on the English Channel are attempting to make a small fortune. It is essential that this government continues to use sanctions and every lever at our disposal to disrupt and destroy these gangs. Thirdly, this government has also made innovative use of sanctions against kleptocrats and their enablers. Notably, the Magnitsky-Style sanctions deployed against Isabel dos Santos, the daughter of Angola's former president, for corruption and for stealing public funds. This marked a pivotal moment in the fight against kleptocracy in Angola, and it helped to address long-standing corruption that had hindered development and worsened inequalities in this country. Of course, I welcome this action, as I'm sure members will on all sides of this House. We must now look to deploy similar sanctions against other kleptocrats and those that enable their corrupt dealings. While all of these are achievements worth celebrating today, I do fear that we are not going quite far and fast enough. Our use of Magnitsky-style sanctions to target human rights abuses has to date been a little too timid. Only 229 individuals and entities have been sanctioned under this style of sanction, which contrasts with nearly 3,000 individuals and entities sanctioned under one country-specific regime, namely Russia. As Redress and other civil society organisations have shown, too many individuals remain unsanctioned despite overwhelming evidence of their involvement in corruption and serious human rights abuses the world over. Despite high-profile designations such as the targeting of Isabel dos Santos, the frankly limited number of Magnitsky-style sanctions imposed does undermine their effectiveness. By focusing only on isolated bad actors, these narrow designations overlook key backers or enablers, and they fail to adapt when entities rebrand or disappear and then reappear simply to sidestep sanctions. To illustrate this problem, here are just three brief examples that highlight this gap in our use of Magnitsky sanctions, allowing those responsible for egregious human rights violations to act with impunity. For instance, just last month, the UK placed sanctions on 4 senior commanders of Sudan's paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, suspected of involvement in heinous violence against civilians in the city of El Fasher. Civil war in Sudan, as has previously been mentioned already, is the world's biggest humanitarian crisis, displacing some 13 million people. There is overwhelming evidence of heinous crimes, mass executions, starvations, and the systemic and calculated use of rape as a weapon of war. Evidence compiled by the UN, experts and journalists have all shown, as has already been cited, that the UAE and its officials have been secretly supplying weapons to the RSF via neighbouring Chad, a position that the Gulf state denies, but an overwhelming total evidence suggests otherwise. However, sadly, no action was taken against the RSF's key military and diplomatic backer, the UAE, or against the chief commander of the RSF. Similarly, the narrow scope of sanctions designations in Georgia also undermines our response to the human rights crisis currently underway. Georgia is increasingly finding itself subject to authoritarian rule. Since the highly disputed election in 2024, during which the Dream Party claimed victory, there has been an escalation in the crackdown on protests and on independent media, including widespread violence and human rights abuses. The Dream Party has now captured almost all government branches and institutions. It has used its newfound power to aggressively suppress protests and all scrutiny of its actions, including hundreds of reports of arbitrary detention and even torture. While the UK has already rightly sanctioned some of those responsible for violent attacks against journalists and protesters, key members of the pro-Russia elite were sadly absent from these designations, including Bidzina Ivanishvili, the founder and chairman of the Georgian Dream Party. This individual was actually sanctioned by the Biden administration in the United States for undermining democratic processes simply for the benefit of the Kremlin. And yet the UK has yet to take the same steps in relation to Georgia. So I ask the Minister to make decisive use of sanctions to crack down on these abuses, which only benefit the Russian government and are entirely at the expense of the Georgian people. Finally, while the UK imposed sanctions on 4 individuals and 1 entity involved in the deadly repression of Uyghur Muslims in China in 2021, it never acted on detailed evidence received from Redress and other human rights organisations which identified the broader command structure behind these violent atrocities committed against the Uyghur people in China. We cannot continue to ignore the calls for sanctions on senior Chinese officials, which have already been put forward today. This must include the Chinese Communist Party Secretary in Xinjiang, considered the architect behind the human rights abuses committed. These three cases all show how limiting our use of Magnitsky-style sanctions undermines their effectiveness. Sanctions are a key tool in our armoury to crack down on the most egregious human rights abuses, but narrow designation overlooks the key backers or enablers of the worst atrocities. Of course, underpinning our sanctions with strong enforcement is also critical to their impact. We know that sanctions are only as strong as the enforcement behind them. In last year's cross-government review of sanctions, the government rightly recognised that there are gaps in the UK sanctions implementation and enforcement, which it is seeking to address through new measures to increase the deterrent effect of sanctions and enhance our ability to take robust action against those who choose to break the rules. Yes.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. He's making an excellent contribution to this debate. We heard evidence on the Treasury Committee last year about the Office for Financial Sanctions implementation, and it appeared to me that they're far too small for the job that they've got to do, especially when you compare them to equivalents overseas in the US and Europe. So does he think that part of the solution is also funding OFSI properly so they're able to be proactive in their monitoring of sanctions and not only reactive?
Thank the honourable member for his intervention. I believe proper resourcing of OFSI is essential for it to be essential. Similarly, other bodies and authorities that fight economic crime must be properly resourced so they can do their job properly. I think there are three further changes that are needed to ensure that there are effective instruments for challenging human rights abuses. First, in order to freeze sanctioned assets, we need to be able to identify their ownership. If we cannot follow ownership of assets through corporate and trust structures, which are often both complex and involve secretive offshore havens, then many of our designations will inevitably seep through the cracks and our enforcement will turn into nothing more than a game of whack-a-mole. Ensuring that we can follow the money is therefore a priority, and that must include the UK's overseas territories and Crown dependencies. The Office for Sanctions implementation found that since February 2022, over a quarter of all suspected sanctions breaches were made using intermediary jurisdictions, including the British Virgin Islands and Guernsey. This is deeply concerning, as those very jurisdictions that are enabling sanctions evasion are dragging their feet on important corporate transparency measures that would help us to follow the money in their backyard. Transparency at home and abroad is essential if sanctions are to be enforced effectively, and that means ending all tolerance of secrecy in our overseas territories and Crown dependencies, which we all know for far too long have provided shelter for dirty money. Second, we must strengthen the policing of sanctions evasion with a clear focus on networks and professional enablers. Reports from the Office for Sanctions implementation have found that it is almost certain that lawyers, estate agents and associated property service firms based right here in the UK have helped clients evade and avoid asset freezes, seemingly undermining our efforts from within. Some companies and enablers with a high-risk appetite are willing to provide services to sanction high-net-worth individuals, allowing them to maintain their property empire and sidestep sanctions altogether. Of course, infamously, the oligarch and former owner of Chelsea FC, one Roman Abramovich, was reportedly able to transfer his extensive property empire and a fleet of super yachts, helicopters and jets to his children just weeks before being sanctioned here in the UK. Shameful. Yet despite the vast scale of sanctions evasion, enforcement of violations by authorities in the UK, I feel, has been too weak in recent years. In the past year, the Office for Sanctions implementation has imposed just 3 fines for violations of the UK's Russia sanctions regime, totalling a measly £622,750. This is an utterly damning figure and shows that we are bringing a water pistol to a knife fight when it comes to enforcing our sanctions measures. Worse still, OFSI has not imposed any fines at all for breaches of Magnitsky-style sanctions. Now, I know the government is planning to scale up our capability to target these professional enabler networks. And in the recently published anti-corruption strategy, which I wholeheartedly welcome, ministers were right to commit to expanding the use of sanctions against professional enablers. Given the UK's world-leading role as a professional services provider, such a measure, I think, is essential if we are to begin to take serious constraints against sanctioned individuals. For example, a professional services ban would be a very effective way that we can start to tackle kleptocrats and human rights abusers. Many of these individuals might not own an asset in the UK or even plan to travel to the UK, but they do rely on UK-based professional services, such as a legal firm and a bank. This simple measure would block wrongdoers from enjoying access to our large professional services sector in the UK. Finally, I do remain concerned that there is a real lack of publicly available data about enforcement capacity, actions and impact, which will undermine Parliament's ability to scrutinise sanctions enforcement and better understand whether they are working or not. Without a credible public picture of what is actually frozen, how can Parliament judge their effectiveness and whether or not enablers may simply be assuming that enforcement in the UK is patchy at best? I ask ministers to look closely and carefully at these proposals to improve data transparency, strengthen our ability to identify ownership and boost the policing of the enablers of sanctions evasion. Madam Deputy Speaker, Magnitsky-style sanctions remain one of the most useful tools at this government's disposal to hold perpetrators of serious human rights abuses and corruption to account. Effective use of these sanctions sends out a clear message. The UK will not act as a safe haven for dirty money that belongs to kleptocrats or human rights abusers. But their effectiveness depends not on their existence alone, but on the political will to use them fully, consistently and credibly. At a time when, unfortunately, the United States sometimes appears reluctant to deploy these tools with the necessary resolve, there is a clear responsibility for the United Kingdom to step forwards and work with a broad coalition of allies and partners to effectively deploy Magnitsky-style sanctions. I know that this government and almost all members of this House are serious about defending human rights, tackling corruption and upholding the rules-based international order. But to achieve this, we must ensure that Magnitsky-style sanctions are not only a symbolic gesture, but sharp, effective instruments used to hold bad actors to account and speak truth to power. As has already been cited, in an age of global uncertainty, with rogue states and corrupt individuals wishing to operate with impunity, that is exactly the type of leadership that this moment demands. Thank you.
Mohamed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would like to thank my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford and Woodford Green, for bringing this important debate on the effectiveness of the Magnitsky-style sanctions for serious human rights abuses forward. These are tools that reflect our values as a country which is meant to defend human rights and the rule of law. Under the UK's autonomous sanctions framework built on the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act 2018 and reinforced by subsequent legislation, the global human rights sanction regime allows us to target individuals and entities responsible for gross violations of human rights, including asset freezes and travel bans. Magnitsky sanctions have been used against perpetrators of egregious abuses in multiple contexts, from Russian officials linked to the death of Sergei Magnitsky to those implicated in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and military leaders in Myanmar. However, today's debate also requires us to consider the broader effectiveness and consistency of these tools in the face of major crises. Multiple authoritative assessments, particularly from redress and UK parliamentary evidence submissions, highlight several areas where the UK Magnitsky sanctions regime has failed to act effectively. Evidence shows the UK has not replicated the majority of Magnitsky sanctions imposed by partner jurisdictions across the US, Canada and the EU. Only 14% of global Magnitsky designations are listed under the UK Magnitsky regime, and another 17% appear under other UK regimes, meaning that 69% of perpetrators sanctions abroad
and not sanctioned by the UK at all. Of the unsanctioned cases, 71% were designated by the US, 27% by Canada and 2% by the EU, yet the UK has not followed suit. The gap means that UK is failing to act against individuals already identified as human rights abusers or corrupt actors by close allies. The UK has received at least 15 detailed evidence packages from NGOs like Redress, documenting alleged human rights abuses or corruption in many of the countries that were referenced by previous speakers, including China, Sudan, Uganda, Bangladesh, Venezuela and others. In many of these cases, the US has already sanctioned the perpetrators, that the UK has failed to act in almost all of them. In terms of the use of the legal powers available, according to parliamentary evidence, since September 2021, the UK sanctioned only 3 individuals under its Magnitsky human rights regime, compared with 105 designation in the preceding period under the previous Foreign Secretary. This reflects a significant slowdown and a lack of strategic direction. There's also poor coordination with our allies in the US, the EU and other sanctioning partners. The recommendations from the APPG on Magnitsky sanctions stress that the UK's unilateral approach weakens sanctions effectiveness. The UK has failed to systematically sanction individuals already targeted by partners, coordinate multilateral actions to target corrupt networks instead of isolated individuals, and match the scale and frequency of designation by allies. UK, under its autonomous sanctions framework, Magnitsky sanctions have been used against egregious abuses that I've already mentioned. However, today's debate also requires us to reflect the broader effectiveness and consistency of these tools. In recent months, the United Kingdom has taken steps to sanction 2 Israeli government ministers over their repeated incitement of violence against Palestinian civilians in the occupied Palestinian territory. These designations, made alongside partners including Canada, Australia, New Zealand and Norway, include travel bans and asset freezes, and were justified by the Foreign Office as necessary responses to genocide and serious abuses of human rights. Moreover, the UK has suspended trade negotiations with Israel in response to its ongoing military offence in Gaza and related violence in the West Bank, and applied sanctions against settlers and settler organisations linked to violence against the Palestinian communities. The scale and scope of action by the UK government has not been sufficient, and we have failed to reflect our obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law to ensure civilians do not suffer, particularly in light of provisional measures from the International Court of Justice ordering protection of civilians in Gaza and actions directed at ending grave human rights violations in Gaza and the West Bank. The sheer scale of suffering in Gaza, including the blockade's effect on civilians and the risk of mass starvation, must prompt far stronger measures, ranging from broader sanctions and trade restrictions to enforcement of legal obligations to prevent atrocities. Instead, we see 37 NGOs, including MSF and IRC, ousted and banned from providing aid across the West Bank and Gaza with impunity. This is despite nearly 1.9 million displaced Gazans being vulnerable to shortages of tents, shelter materials, medical assistance, clean water and sanitation support during winter. And still we refuse to go further on sanctions and punishment on Israel's actions. At the same time, the UK government has stressed its continued support for Israel's security, whilst the Israeli government expands illegal settlements deeper and deeper into Palestinian territory. We have recognised the state of Palestine, which is a welcome step, but we must follow that up with fulfilling our obligations under that recognition for the Palestinian people. All of this illustrates an essential point. Magnitsky-style sanctions are neither symbolic nor irrelevant, but their effectiveness depends on consistent, principled application, rigorous enforcement, and alignment with broader obligation and foreign policy goals. Targeted sanctions are most effective when they clearly align with international law, evidence, and credible human rights concerns, are coordinated with international partners to avoid loopholes and politicisation, and are part of a broader strategy that includes diplomacy, humanitarian advocacy, and engagement with multilateral justice mechanisms. Used in isolations, sanctions risk being dismissed as gestures rather than instruments of accountability. Used in coordination with wider action, they can contribute meaningfully to deterrence, pressure for change, and justice for victims. Madam Deputy Speaker, the United Kingdom should make a principled use of Magnitsky-style sanctions wherever there is credible evidence of human rights abuses, whether in Russia, the Middle East, Sudan, Myanmar, or elsewhere. But it must also be prepared to act boldly and consistently in line with international law when confronted with mass civilian suffering anywhere on the globe. Our inconsistent approach to human rights and the protection of so-called allies condemns us all to an unsafe world where might is right and wrongdoing is never corrected. We shame our enemies at the same stroke of a pen as we sign away the human rights we like to proclaim as sacrosanct. We must ensure our sanctions regime is more than a statement of values, but a tool that genuinely contributes to accountability, justice, and prevention of atrocities. I commend the motion to the House.
Powell. Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you. And can I first join in congratulating the Right Honourable Member for securing this debate. As he rightly said, an effective sanctions regime is an increasingly important foreign policy and defence tool. And having worked before coming to this place on anti-corruption and open government efforts internationally for over a decade, I know they can make a real impact. And I also agree with him that that is both the threat of effective sanctions as well as the execution. So as others have said, I am pleased that the government has introduced over 900 new sanctions against individuals, entities and ships under the Russia sanctions regime, and over 60 designations under human rights and anti-corruption specifically. I know how seriously the Minister takes this tool, and I do want to sincerely thank him and his officials for what I know is complex work. I believe the UK's ambition on sanctions is at the edge of global leadership, but that means we have to continually look for ways to make the system more effective. And I'd like to suggest a couple of areas. One obvious one, where I know the government is working hard, is on the transparency of asset ownership across jurisdictions. If you want sanctions to work, you have to know where the assets are. And transparency is an important prerequisite for effective targeting. To give one example, approximately 40% of the foreign-owned properties in Kensington and Chelsea are controlled by trusts, and we have some of the largest numbers of frozen property in our borough through sanctions. And now trusts are not automatically included in the foreign-owned property register, and while the information can now be made available on request, the lack of open data, I believe, makes it harder to track real ownership, and I know the government's looking at this question. Similarly, the long-standing effort to bring in transparent beneficial ownership registers, as my honourable friend has mentioned, in the UK overseas territories and Crown dependencies, would enable better tracking of assets under the control of sanctioned individuals. So I support the government review of asset and beneficial ownership in the UK by Baroness Hodge, the anti-corruption champion, as part of the anti-corruption strategy to identify where vulnerabilities may be, and I hope her recommendations can support our sanctions regime to be more effective. Internationally, data sharing on this issue is also really important. So with the illicit finance summit coming up in May, I hope the Minister can maybe outline how sanctions policy and international cooperation around it can be on the agenda. And in terms of scope, I think there may be potential in looking at how the two Magnitsky-Style sanctions regimes interact. particularly in terms of corruption related to abuse of function, trading in influence and illicit enrichment, because they do bridge human rights and corruption. And finally, on scope, I do hope the Minister will keep under close review the potential effectiveness of sanctions related to Georgia. I've met with Georgian civil society who have been calling for the UK to expand our sanctions further, including to Mr Ivanishvili and his top officials. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, for sanctions to be effective, they have to bite, and enforcement is critical. So I welcome the government's approach of working multilaterally with allies to maximise effectiveness. But it's also important that we look closer to home. Roman Abramovich is a former resident of Kensington and Chelsea, and he still owns frozen property in my constituency. As the House will no doubt be aware, he was sanctioned in March 2022 and his UK assets were frozen. In May 2022, he sold Chelsea FC under an agreement that the sale proceeds would be used for humanitarian need in Ukraine. It is shameful that almost 4 years later, that money has still not been released. So I strongly welcome the Prime Minister's leadership in issuing a licence last month to release the money within 90 days and a commitment to take legal action if necessary. This is a case of profound national and international importance and a test of whether our sanctions should have the bite that they should. So I do find it astonishing, and I respect the Right Honourable Gentleman's cross-party spirit of this, but I do find it astonishing that such a serious conflict of interest has now emerged at the top of the Conservative Party. Shameful. As Sybil Browder himself has said, the man who has spearheaded the global campaign for Magnitsky sanctions, how is it possible that a shadow Attorney General can, and I quote, moonlight as the attorney for a Russian oligarch who is trying to wiggle out of a £2.5 billion deal to aid victims of the war in Ukraine that he made with the UK government? Back in the day, that was called a conflict of interest. And I agree with Sybil, and I suspect the Right Honourable Gentleman has sympathy with this point. And the details, Madam Deputy Speaker, matter here. Yesterday, Lord Wolfson published a letter saying that the Prime Minister got his facts wrong and that he was not advising Mr Abramovich on UK sanctions or the proceeds of Chelsea FC. Now, first, the Prime Minister did not in fact say that Lord Wolfson is advising Roman Abramovich with regard to UK sanctions and the proceeds of sale of Chelsea FC. The Prime Minister, however, did say that Lord Wolfson is advising Mr Abramovich. That is true, as both Lord Wolfson and the opposition spokesperson have now confirmed, and the record, in my view, should be corrected. Second, Lord Wolfson's letter omitted the most crucial piece of new information released by the opposition spokesperson yesterday, which is that the Shadow Attorney General has now recused himself from advising the Leader of the Opposition and Shadow Ministers on Ukraine and Russia. Now, quite apart from whether you can be an effective Shadow Attorney General when you are unable to provide legal advice on the most important issues facing this country, including Ukraine's security guarantees, to name but one, this recusal raises serious questions. Does it include efforts to tackle the Russian shadow fleet, including the military action yesterday? Does it include sanctions policy and enforcement? Does it include tax policy? As we know, the BBC have said that Abramovich could owe up to £1 billion of UK tax after a botched attempt to avoid tax on hedge fund investments via shell companies in the British Virgin Islands. Shameful. Third, it is naive in the extreme to think that it is possible to separate the various legal cases Mr Abramovich is engaged in which affect UK national interest. The Times reported that Abramovich's own representatives say that £1.4 billion of the proceeds from the sale of Chelsea cannot be released to a charitable foundation until legal proceedings brought by the Jersey government are concluded. So I would welcome clarification from the shadow front bench, from the Minister, whether they consider that the ongoing litigation and Mr Abramovich's position on its connection to the transfer of the Chelsea FC proceeds conflicts with the ability of that money to be transferred speedily. Fourth, there has been a concerted effort to conflate the vital principle of the right to legal representation with preventing a conflict of interest occurring. I absolutely support the right of people that I may find disreputable or worse to have legal counsel, including sanctioned individuals. That is the basis of a strong legal system. But it is a choice to serve as Shadow Attorney General, and it is a choice to represent a sanctioned Russian oligarch in the Jersey case. My view is that these two roles are incompatible. By recusing himself from giving the Conservative Party legal advice on Ukraine and Russia, Lord Wolfson has confirmed himself that it is not possible, in his view, to do this while being paid to represent Roman Abramovich, and that given the choice, being paid to represent Roman Abramovich is more important to him than fulfilling his duties as Shadow Attorney General. He could have made the opposite choice, and he did not. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want our sanctions regime to be as effective as possible. I know the government is committed to continuing to learn and adapt as it evolves. And I hope, and I really mean this, that the Leader of the Opposition will clear up this mess that has been created and restore the cross-party consensus that I think is in our national interest.
Tim Roca.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I begin by thanking my honourable friend, the member for Chingford, for bringing about this debate and for being a Doughty champion for British citizens unfairly imprisoned abroad. Colleagues have already this afternoon made clear that Magnitsky sanctions are not an abstract policy instrument but a really powerful tool. So for me, this afternoon is really whether we're prepared to use that tool, that power fully and consistently on behalf of our citizens. But I think it's worth reminding ourselves of how all this began. We call these measures Magnitsky sanctions for a reason. Because a young man, Sergei Magnitsky, paid with his life for exposing corruption, and because he left behind an irrefutable paper trail that shows us exactly how authoritarian injustice works. Sergei was a Russian tax lawyer, not an activist, not a dissident, but he uncovered fraud of extraordinary scale involving the theft of millions of dollars carried out by state officials in Russia using the very institutions meant to uphold the law. He did what the law demanded of him. He documented it, testified, and trusted that evidence would matter. Instead, the state turned on him. He was arrested by the very officials he had implicated and placed in pre-trial detention, where, as he put it, punishment begins long before guilt is even alleged. What sets Sergei apart and why we still speak his name is what he did next. Even as his world narrowed to concrete walls and iron doors, he documented everything. Over 450 complaints, petitions, diary entries written by hand, often without a table, sometimes in freezing cells, under conditions designed to break the human spirit. In a letter to his lawyer in August 2009, he said justice under such conditions turns into the process of grinding human meat in preparation for prisons and camps. And that phrase was not rhetoric. It's a description of a system where detention itself becomes the punishment, where exhaustion, humiliation, and neglect replace the rule of law. Sergei was moved repeatedly between cells, often at night, deprived of sleep, but he still refused to withdraw his testimony or plead guilt, so his conditions worsened. He was placed in cells flooded with raw sewage. He slept in his coat because the windows had no glass. Rats ran freely at night across the prison. And fatally, Sergei was denied medical treatment. Despite a diagnosis of pancreatitis, escalating pain, despite written pleas, verbal pleas, petitions to judges, prosecutors, and officials, his requests were ignored. One official told him plainly that he would only get help available after release and that nobody was obliged to provide it to him in detention. His last note was asking when the ultrasound prescribed months earlier would finally be done. It never was. On November 16, 2009, he died on a prison floor after being restrained, isolated, and denied emergency care. Clearly, a gross breach of human rights. And even then, in death, the system denied responsibility. And that's why Magnitsky sanctions exist, because Sergei and the incredible campaign of Sybil Browder showed us that truth outlives prison walls and that accountability has to cross borders. So why does this matter today? Because we're seeing the same injustice applied to the case of Ryan Cornelius, not in Moscow, but in Dubai.
The Right Honourable Member for Chingford has already talked a little bit about Ryan's case. He was arrested in 2008, convicted of fraud in 2010. But that sentence that he received, harsh as it was, had an end date, and he served it. But just weeks before his scheduled release, it was extended by a further 20 years, using a law introduced after his original conviction, with no proper hearing and no meaningful right of appeal. That's not justice. That detention is leverage. And here the parallels with Sergei are stark. Like Sergei, Ryan was arbitrarily detained according to the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. Like Sergei, he's been denied due process. Like Sergei, he's been punished for refusing to concede or comply. Like Sergei, he's enjoyed degrading prison conditions and inadequate medical care during a serious bout of tuberculosis. But unlike Sergei, and this should trouble this House deeply, Ryan Cornelius is a British citizen. The UN has ruled his detention arbitrary, as I say. Experts have raised the alarm. His family, who, as I say, are in the gallery today, some of them, have campaigned for years. Some of them have lost everything. And members from across this House and from across parties have spoken up. Yet Ryan remains in prison. If Magnitsky sanctions are not relevant in this case, we must really ask ourselves, what are they actually for? So I'm grateful that we've heard of some of the names related to the Dubai Investment Bank, and I hope the government will take away those names and think very carefully about the use of the powers that we have, which seem wholly appropriate in this instance. So what does this House want from the Magnitsky sanctions regime? And I'm grateful that a number of members have made these points. We want them to be more than just symbolic. We want them to be consistent. We want them to be ambitious. We want them to be principled. And we've been very honest, I'm grateful to the member for South Dorset in particular, about where our use of these sanctions have fallen short. Since we introduced the regime, we designated 229 individuals and entities under it. And whilst these measures have had a meaningful impact in some cases, overall we've applied it in a limited and inconsistent way. And we know that the FCDO from civil society organisations have received dossiers and evidence in their hundreds, potentially thousands, implicating perpetrators, but only a small number have been sanctioned. And the contrast has already been made with the UK's response to the invasion of Russia. And I will say, I don't want to denigrate that response, because I think the Minister in particular, along with his colleagues, have worked incredibly hard on this, and credit where credit is due. But it demonstrates that where a political will exists, we do act at scale. And that's what we want to see in other cases as well. Because the inconsistency is particularly evident in cases involving UK strategic partners or trade allies, and in relation to conflict-related sexual violence, despite the UK's Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict initiative. It's also clear of the failure to use the regime, Madam Deputy Speaker, robustly in response, as I've made the point with Ryan Cornelius, to British nationals arbitrarily detained abroad. And beyond designation decisions, weak enforcement is further undermining the regime. To date, no fines have been imposed for breaches of Magnitsky sanctions. Reports indicate widespread evasion involving professional enablers, opaque corporate structures and overseas territories, as has been very capably pointed out already. And in addition, there is no obligation at the moment for the government to report to Parliament on the use of these sanctions, something which I believe should change. The UK lacks a strategy for managing frozen assets and ensuring that sanctions contribute to justice for victims and survivors. Funds can remain untouched for years, losing value, whilst survivors receive no reparations. And I'm thinking here of the family of Ryan Cornelius in particular. I know his wife Heather, I think, is effectively homeless as a result of the circumstances that she faces. At present, all the proceeds flow back to the Treasury rather than to those harmed by the underlying violations. So let's use these sanctions ambitiously, consistently and appropriately, in combination with other mechanisms, if they're effective in upholding human rights, tackling illicit finance and preventing this country from becoming a haven for war criminals and kleptocrats. Madam Deputy Speaker, Sergei Magnitsky showed us what courage looks like when the law collapses. Ryan Cornelius reminds us what happens when we hesitate to act. Sanctions are not about vengeance, they're about drawing a line and saying that no official, no banker, no judge is beyond accountability when they participate in grave injustice. So, if we honour Sergei's legacy, we must be prepared to act with the same clarity he showed, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's inconvenient, but especially when one of our own is still paying the price. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green for securing this important debate today. And I am pleased to see the Minister in his place. He's already heard plenty from colleagues in the Chamber today on the subject of sanctions, and I hope today's debate will provide further food for thought. I'd like to start by saying this. Effective sanctions regimes for human rights violations and corruption speak to who we are as a nation. A nation which stands up for the rule of law, a nation which respects international law, a nation that says, wherever you are and whoever you are, if you persecute individuals, if you plunder your country's resources, and if you embezzle from your own people, there will be consequences. And the reason we're having this debate today, to my mind, is not to call for some shiny new instrument to hold the world's criminals and corrupt to account. Rather, it is for better use of the world-leading tools we already have to deny the very human rights abusers and kleptocrats access to our financial system, our professional services and our property market. And I want to focus on two particular threads. First, what I see as the inconsistent and inadequate use of Magnitsky sanctions against serious human rights abusers, particularly in Georgia and Hong Kong. And secondly, the failure to enforce sanctions properly, allowing evasion, secrecy and professional enablers to undermine the entire regime. Now, let me begin with Georgia, because Georgia is a country that should be moving closer to Europe, not sliding backwards into the authoritarianism for the benefit of Moscow. Yet since the highly disputed parliamentary election of 26th of October 2024, this is exactly what we've seen. All branches of government and state institutions now captured by Bidzina Ivanishvili and the Georgian Dream Party. Civic space crushed. Independent media and civil society organisations targeted under a new foreign agent law, legislation which comes straight out of the Kremlin's playbook, and peaceful protests have been met time and time again with violence. The UK has, quite rightly, sanctioned some individuals responsible for violent attacks on journalists and protesters, and that is very much welcome. But as the Minister knows, I don't feel it's enough, and the omissions are glaring. Most notably, the UK has failed to sanction Bidzina Ivanishvili, the individual widely regarded as exercising decisive influence over Georgia's political direction. I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. And does he share my concern that the current situation in Georgia is not dissimilar to what we've seen in other Central and Eastern European countries and beyond, where Russia seeks to have greater political influence and control, and they have a mission creep, and unless countries such as the United Kingdom push back against that early, they will continue to infringe and extend their tentacles into political life in countries such as Georgia.
Well, I thank the Honourable Friend for his contribution. He's quite right about the spheres of influence that Russia is seeking to exert across Central and Eastern Europe. Ivanishvili could be sanctioned under any number of our regimes, Magnitsky, global anti-corruption, or even the Russian sanctions regime, given his reported links to the Kremlin and blatant kowtowing to Moscow. And on Georgia, just this morning, I've been made aware that the Georgian Dream have increased state financing for the Kulevi oil refinery, which Reuters has reported received its first shipment of Russian oil in October of last year. That refinery itself is linked to Vladimir Alexeyev, first deputy chief of Russia's GRU. This seems to be an obvious route for sanctions violations, and I hope it will be added to Ivanishvili's rap sheet. Whilst I know the Minister will be unable to comment on individual cases, can he at least confirm that Ivanishvili's supported status as too big to fail due to his alleged personal importance to the Georgian economy does not preclude him from being sanctioned by this country? Now, I'll come to the United States later, but our allies across the Atlantic sanctioned Ivanishvili on the 27th of December 2024 for undermining democratic processes on behalf of or for the benefit of Russia. And I certainly don't suggest we follow the US in every aspect of foreign policy, but they are correct in applying that designation. Sanctioning cronies and underlings can make an impact, but let's be clear, the fish rots from the head. My fear is that our silence on Ivanishvili sends the wrong message to would-be kleptocrats around the world. Now let me turn to Hong Kong and the ongoing repression there, which is of keen interest to me and the valued community of Hong Kongers across my Bolton West constituency. The dismantling of Hong Kong's freedoms is unacceptable. Since the imposition of the national security law, we've seen the systematic criminalisation of dissent, independent media shut down, civil society organisations dissolved, elected opposition figures jailed, and fundamental freedoms erased in all but name. This is textbook human rights abuse. And the case of Jimmy Lai, who's already been mentioned in this debate today, symbolises that injustice, a point reminded to me by my own constituents who used to work with Jimmy Lai back in Hong Kong. As a British national, a publisher, and a peaceful advocate of democracy, Jimmy Lai has been in prison for years for exercising rights that we regard in this place as fundamental. He now faces the prospect of spending the rest of his life behind bars under a law designed to silence free speech, not to deliver justice. And of course, I welcome the Foreign Secretary's strong condemnation of his sham trial last month, but words alone do not protect political prisoners. And if Magnitsky sanctions are to retain any credibility, they must be used against those responsible for the erosion of Hong Kong's autonomy and for the persecution of individuals like Jimmy Lai. And that includes officials who designed, implemented and enforced the national security law, and those who have overseen its use to crush free expression and political participation. And this brings me to a wider point. We're entering a period in which the United States cannot always be relied on to apply evidence-based sanctions. In that context, the UK cannot simply wait for Washington to lead. We must be prepared to act where the United States will not. And we should also not be afraid, as critical friends, to point out where the US gets it wrong. I did ask the Minister earlier this week at the Foreign Affairs Committee for his response to Trump's sanctioning of 2 British citizens for seeking to, as Secretary Rubio sees it, coerce American tech platforms into suppressing free speech. Does the Minister agree with me that this is dangerous nonsense? And this brings me to my second theme, enforcement. Increasing designations alone is not enough. Sanctions without enforcement are no sanction at all. They are just suggestions. And we now have a vast and complex sanctions architecture: Magnitsky sanctions, Russia sanctions, anti-corruption sanctions. Since Putin's barbaric invasion of Ukraine, we've had a massive boost in our own sanctions capacity and seen a huge undertaking in the private sector to keep up. Yet enforcement in the UK remains worryingly weak. We know sanctions are being evaded. We heard earlier about Roman Abramovich reportedly transferring his UK property empire to his children just weeks before being sanctioned. The very same individual who's now being represented by the Conservative Shadow Attorney General over a dispute with the Jersey government on the source of his wealth. And as my honourable friend, the member for Kensington and Bayswater, has forensically outlined earlier in this debate, if the opposition is serious about standing by Ukraine, they can't have their top law officer serving in the other place and attending shadow cabinet meetings as well. It's simply incredible. So does the Minister agree with me that Lord Wolfson's position in the shadow cabinet or attending those meetings is now completely untenable? Now, the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation itself has concluded it is almost certain that UK lawyers, estate agents and property service firms have helped clients evade asset freezes. And as my friend the Honourable Member for South Dorset has outlined, in the past year, officers imposed fines just 3 times for breaches of the UK sanctions regime, totalling just over £622,000. That is a rounding error compared to the scale of wealth at stake, and it is simply not a credible deterrent. All the while, there have been no breaches for Magnitsky sanctions in the past year. And this issue is acute in the British overseas territories, where low policing capacity and high financial secrecy create ideal conditions for sanctions evasion. Now, there have been, I must say, some laudable efforts in the OTs to enforce sanctions, but too often I've been made aware of civil society organisations submitting detailed evidence of Magnitsky sanctions breaches in the overseas territories, but receiving no meaningful response at all from those jurisdictions. Can the Minister therefore assure me today that he will ensure that British overseas territories which receive such detailed allegations will act on them? Because we must tackle the scourge of corporate secrecy in offshore financial centres linked to the UK head on. If we're to ensure that our sanctions bite as much as possible, there is an urgent need for those overseas territories that continue to drag their feet, including the British Virgin Islands, to finally adopt fully public registers of beneficial ownership, as they have promised time and time again but failed to deliver. As an interim step, he will agree with me that individuals with a legitimate interest, I'm sure, including journalists and civil society, must have meaningful access to beneficial ownership information, because without that transparency, asset freezes cannot be enforced effectively. I look forward to the update on this issue promised earlier this year by the government's new anti-corruption strategy, but I wonder if he's able to provide any further information on timelines.
I would encourage the honourable gentleman to bring his remarks to a conclusion, because we do have another debate and we have got the front benches to come in yet. Phil Brickell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Transparency is the name of the game here, so can the Minister confirm whether his department has looked at publishing comprehensive data on assets frozen within UK jurisdictions broken down by asset class, including assets held by individuals, by state-owned enterprises and by states themselves? The reason I ask is simple. Parliament can't assess effectiveness of our regimes if it can't see the full picture. So let me end with this. Magnitsky sanctions are one of the most powerful tools we have to defend human rights, but they only work if they're used consistently, if they're enforced rigorously and connected clearly to accountability and to reparation. If the UK wants to be a global champion of human rights, it must stop being a safe haven for those who abuse them and start ensuring that sanctions mean something on paper and in practice.
Yeah. Liberal Democrat spokesperson Dr Al Pinkerton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Honourable Gentleman for Chingford and Woodford Green for securing this important debate. I think he once, I seem to remember, referred to himself as a quiet man, but he's had a very loud voice on this issue, and I congratulate him for it. And can I also congratulate the other excellent speeches that we've had today, the Honourable Members for South Dorset, Dewsbury and Batley, Kensington and Bayswater, Macclesfield and Bolton West all took us on a journey through different territories, different spaces, different countries, and remind us indeed of the history of this important name that we associate with the kind of sanctions that we're talking about today. Madam Deputy Speaker, we're living through a period marked by rising authoritarianism, escalating human rights abuses and the increasing use of corruption and repression as tools of state power. In that context, Magnitsky-Style sanctions are among the most powerful instruments in our armoury to uphold human rights, defend international law and promote democracy. Their strength lies in the fact that they target perpetrators, not populations, individuals, not states, holding those responsible to account without inflicting further humanitarian harm on civilians, or at least they do when they are working at their best. Magnitsky sanctions were designed to establish both legitimacy and intent. Now, as members have noted, they include asset freezes, travel bans and restrictions on financial transactions aimed directly at individuals who violate international law or who commit serious human rights abuses. Their purpose is to reduce the humanitarian costs associated with blanket sanctions, to draw a clear line between civilians and abusers, and to provide a mechanism for accountability where domestic justice systems very often fail. Now, when used consistently and in coordination with our democratic allies, these sanctions carry real power. They deter future abuses, impose reputational and financial consequences, and challenge the assumption among perpetrators that they can act with impunity. Yet, despite their importance, the United Kingdom's current approach is, I would contend, still falling short, and in so doing is undermining the very purpose of these sanctions. Application remains inconsistent, enforcement, as we've heard, is insufficient, and transparency and oversight are often inadequate. Sanctions only retain their power when they are applied coherently, consistently, and with the political will to enforce them. The Liberal Democrats believe that Magnitsky sanctions remain essential, yet too many individuals credibly implicated in serious abuses and corruption remain unsanctioned. Even where sanctions are imposed, those targeted continue to exploit evasion methods. Delays, gaps and selective application fundamentally weaken deterrence and erode confidence in this regime. We have consistently argued that the UK must be prepared to act decisively, rather than hesitating or allowing political convenience to override principle. On human rights and the rule of law, the United Kingdom must be a leader and not a follower. A key weakness lies in how Magnitsky sanctions are operationalised. There is no clear strategic approach to when and how these powers are used, leading to narrow and often selective application that ultimately undermines deterrence. Structural complexity has discouraged bold action and weakened the overall effectiveness of the Magnitsky regime in the UK. Now, that problem is compounded by a lack of alignment with our allies. A significant number of individuals sanctioned by partners such as the United States, the European Union and Canada are not mirrored by the UK, reducing the collective impact of coordinated action. In fact, in 2022, the UK failed to replicate 69% of global Magnitsky designations. Now, let me be clear, these sanctions will not serve their intended purpose without close international coordination. Moreover, unlike the United States, the UK does not operate under a single, clearly defined Magnitsky Act. Instead, our framework risks producing narrower and less transparent criteria for designation, particularly in cases involving serious human rights abuses and grand corruption. If we're serious about accountability, we must be bolder, clearer and more decisive in how we use these powers. That is why the Liberal Democrats would prioritise the defence of democracy and promotion of human rights globally, deepen coordination of sanctions policy with our democratic allies, particularly in relation to Russia, and strengthen economic crime legislation to close loopholes that allow sanctioned individuals to evade accountability. Sanctions must be backed by rigorous enforcement and tougher vetting of major investments, or they simply will not work. And that principle applies just as strongly to the protection of British nationals overseas. Arbitrary detention is not diplomacy, it's coercion. And that is why, as well as appointing a dedicated envoy for arbitrary detention, Magnitsky sanctions must be a tool for enforcement, ensuring that hostage-taking carries a personal cost to those who would seek to perpetrate it. Looking ahead, the future development of the UK sanction policy must be genuinely joined up across government. Only a whole-of-government approach can ensure effective enforcement, close loopholes and maintain both the credibility and moral authority of our sanctions regime. The Liberal Democrats are clear about what this means in practice. Sanctions must target the individuals responsible for human rights abuses, not just states. Economic crime legislation must be strengthened to prevent evasion. Magnitsky sanctions must be used proactively, not reluctantly, as they so often appear to be now. Arms export controls must reflect our human rights obligations, and asset freezing and seizure must be used to stop the flow of dirty money through our financial system. That clarity must be reflected in our response to events around the world. In Hong Kong, a territory that we've heard several times today, the Liberal Democrats want to see Magnitsky sanctions imposed on those responsible for the erosion of freedoms and the unacceptable targeting of pro-democracy activists, including those here in the United Kingdom. The arrest warrants recently issued by Beijing are a disgraceful attempt to interfere in our democracy, and they must be met with actions that befit the words that are so often spoken in this place and elsewhere. And that same boldness is required in response to Russia. We must work with our European partners to seize and repurpose frozen Russian assets, up to 30 billion of which are held in the UK, and direct them towards humanitarian, financial and military support for Ukraine. Sanctions that are not enforced do not constrain aggression, they just enable it. And that consistency must be extended to Israel too. The Liberal Democrats were the first major UK-wide party to call for a full ban on military exports to Israel. And we continue to demand sanctions against Prime Minister Netanyahu and his cabinet ministers for their conduct in Gaza. International law must apply to everyone without exception, and that includes senior figures in the UAE for their personal and institutional support for the still unfolding atrocities in Sudan. And so, in conclusion, Magnitsky sanctions are undoubtedly a powerful tool, but they cannot be deployed only when it's politically convenient. If the United Kingdom is to retain credibility on the world stage, our sanctions regime must be principled, consistent and enforced with resolve. Only then can it serve its true purpose: accountability for abusers, justice for victims and the defence of the values we claim to uphold.
Shadow Minister Wendy Morton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And may I begin by congratulating my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford and Woodford Green, on securing this debate. He has long been a determined and principled advocate for human rights and it's entirely fitting that he brought this important issue before the House for debate today. I'd also like to thank members from across the House for the many contributions that they've also made too. But this debate is not about whether Magnitsky-style sanctions are justified. They are. It is about whether they are being used as effectively as they should be, and whether the government is doing enough to ensure that they deliver real consequences for those responsible for the gravest human rights violations. The UK has one of the most developed autonomous sanctions regimes in the world. The Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act, introduced by the last Conservative government, gives ministers the power to impose asset freezes and travel bans on individuals and entities responsible for serious human rights abuses and corruption. That framework was designed to give the UK the ability to act decisively, in coordination with allies, and without delay. Ministers spoke of a regime capable of reaching from Xinjiang to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi to the persecution of the Rohingya. Those ambitions were right. But the test is how the regime is applied in practice, because sanctions that are slow, inconsistently applied, or weakly enforced do not deter abusers. They signal hesitation. Much of today's debate has understandably focused on Russia, and rightly so. Since launching its illegal, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia has been responsible for widespread and systematic abuses, including war crimes and crimes against humanity. The UK's response has been significant, and it was under the last Conservative government that the framework for these measures was put in place. And as a result, around £28.7 billion in Russian-linked assets have now been frozen. But freezing assets is only part of the picture. So I'd like to ask the Minister, how is this sanctions regime being enforced? How many investigations has the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation opened in the last year? And how many enforcement actions have been taken, and how many penalties imposed? Because without visible and credible enforcement, there is a real risk that sanctions become something that can be managed, worked around, or even absorbed as a cost of doing business. Several members have raised the issue of Russia's so-called shadow fleet, the vessels and the networks used to evade sanctions and to continue exporting oil. The government has sanctioned a number of ships, which is welcome. But as others have said, the shadow fleet is consistently adapting. It relies on complex ownership structures, opaque insurance arrangements, and ship-to-ship transfers designed to obscure origin and destination. As my right honourable friend, the member for Witham, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, has made clear from this dispatch box, enforcement needs to be relentless, not only identifying vessels, but targeting the wider networks that enable this activity. And that brings me to a recent example which raises important questions about enforcement. Recent reporting has suggested that sanctioned Russian crude oil was delivered to a refinery part-owned by Lakshmi Mittal, a UK resident businessman, using vessels that had already been blacklisted by Western authorities. Those shipments reportedly involved ship-to-ship transfers and other practices commonly associated with sanctions evasion. These reports may or may not ultimately lead to enforcement action, and I have written to the Director of OFSI to seek clarification, but they do underline a wider point. If sanctions are to be effective, they must follow all those involved in enabling sanction busting, not just the ships themselves. That includes those who benefit from, who facilitate, finance or fail to exercise proper oversight over the continued flow of Russian oil revenues. When credible concerns are raised about potential sanctions circumvention involving UK-linked individuals or businesses, there must be confidence that those concerns are examined rigorously and without hesitation. So I ask the Minister today, does he know whether OFSI is actively assessing the activity reported in connection with Mr Mittal's refinery? How does OFSI approach cases where supply chains are deliberately complex, where they span multiple jurisdictions and are designed to obscure accountability? And how is the government ensuring that enforcement action keeps pace with increasingly sophisticated attempts to evade sanctions in the energy sector? It's also reasonable to ask whether the government is prepared to apply the same level of scrutiny where individuals with UK links hold influential positions, such as directorships in major international institutions, banks and multinational companies, while also being connected to sectors implicated in Russian energy flows. So can the Minister confirm that no individual, however prominent, and no corporate structure, however complex, is treated as being beyond scrutiny? Because sanctions must be applied consistently and without exception, because their credibility depends upon it. But Magnitsky-Style sanctions were never intended to apply to Russia alone, of course. They were designed to target serious human rights abuses wherever they occur. So I'd like to turn to a number of other areas. Firstly, Sudan, which has been mentioned today. We welcome the sanctions that have already been imposed on individuals associated with the RSF, but the situation on the ground remains dire. Civilians continue to suffer, particularly in Darfur. So what more is being done? Are further designations under active consideration? And how are sanctions being used alongside diplomatic efforts at the UN and with regional partners to press for a ceasefire and accountability? Secondly, I would like to turn to people smuggling and human trafficking. These are crimes mentioned today. They involve exploitation, violence and abuse on a large scale, often facilitated by corruption and financial secrecy. In 2025 alone, more than 41,000 illegal migrants crossed the Channel in small boats, nearly 5,000 more than the previous year. Has the government considered whether Magnitsky-style sanctions could be used more systematically against the leaders of these criminal networks, particularly where there's evidence of corruption or serious human rights abuse? And what assessment is made of that option? There are a number of long-standing and deeply concerning situations where Magnitsky sanctions remain highly relevant. In Hong Kong and China, the UK has sanctioned some officials for abuses in Xinjiang and for undermining rights and freedoms. And that was the right decision. But serious concerns remain. For instance, not a single Chinese or Hong Kong official has been sanctioned in connection with the dismantling of Hong Kong's freedoms, despite more than 200,000 Hong Kongers relocating to the UK. And the recent guilty verdict against Jimmy Lai is a stark reminder of the continued assault on the rule of law, on press freedom and judicial independence in Hong Kong. So I ask the Minister, is the government actively considering Magnitsky-style sanctions against CCP officials involved in that case, including those responsible for political interference in the judicial system? And what actions is being taken against those responsible for placing bounties on the heads of activists, including individuals now living here in the UK, in acts of clear transnational repression? The US has already sanctioned officials linked to these bounties. Why has the UK not followed suit? But more broadly, these issues sit alongside growing concerns about foreign influence and intimidation here in the UK, including through the proposed Chinese super embassy in London and the need for effective implementation of FIRS, the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme. How confident is the Minister that the UK sanctions policy, its approach to foreign influence and its response to transnational repression are properly aligned? Turning briefly to Iran, and the regime's response to peaceful protests, as we see, has been brutal. Arbitrary detention, torture and executions continue. So what further steps are being taken to sanction those responsible for repression? And how is the UK working with partners to ensure that Iranian officials involved in these abuses cannot move or hide assets abroad? In Myanmar, nearly 4 years after the coup, the military junta continues to carry out widespread abuses against civilians. So are additional designations being prepared? And how is the UK ensuring that sanctions remain targeted, relevant and effective over time? Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm just about to conclude, so just let me continue a little more. I want to turn briefly to Venezuela, where decisive action taken by the US against the Maduro regime have once again underlined the seriousness of the human rights and democratic crisis facing that country. Against that backdrop, can the Minister set out clearly the government's current approach to Venezuela sanctions, how human rights considerations have been reflected in policy, and whether Magnitsky-style sanctions remain firmly on the table before individuals, remain on the table. So let me just take that intervention, then I will finally conclude.
For giving way. I wonder if she would consider briefly responding to my question about whether she thinks it is appropriate for the Shadow Attorney General to be simultaneously advising shadow ministers and a sanctioned Russian oligarch.
I'm happy to respond to that. And I think I would refer the Honourable Gentleman and his colleague, who also raised this question, to a letter which Lord Wolfson, the Shadow Attorney General, has published, and it makes it very, very clear in setting out that position. So, but when we go back to the debate, when we step back, a clear pattern emerges. Sanctions only work if they are enforced rigorously, applied consistently, and backed by the political will to follow the evidence wherever it leads. So I close with a few final questions for the Minister. How is the Government strengthening enforcement against sanctions evasion, particularly in complex sectors such as energy and shipping? And where do they see the next priority for designations? What steps are being taken to improve transparency and accountability to Parliament? Because if sanctions are to serve their purpose, they must be more than symbolic. They must be enforced, credible and consistent. That is what victims of human rights abuses deserve, and that is what the UK's reputation as a serious and principled actor on the world stage requires. Thank you.
Minister.
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I first start by thanking the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green for securing the debate. He always speaks with conviction and passion, has been absolutely consistent on these issues for a very long time, and I recognise his leadership as chair of the group. And indeed, I would add that we stand in full support of, indeed, him and every colleague in this House, including your colleague, Deputy Speaker, who stands up for our values and have been sanctioned as a result. I'm grateful to all the contributions there have been. I think they've been constructively critical, and I can assure both the Right Honourable Member but all members that our teams will take very, very seriously, particularly some of the individual cases that have been raised. I will try my best in the time to respond to all the key points. But really, I do want to emphasise from the start, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I absolutely share the ambition of members across this House, and I take on board the challenge. And indeed, I would have made and did make many similar points in opposition on these issues in similar debates. What I would say, though, and I really do want to emphasise this to colleagues, is the absolutely extraordinary work of the officials at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and indeed other teams across government who work on these issues. Resource is also finite. I want to be absolutely honest. We have substantially invested in, will continue to do so. We've set very ambitious targets, including on the issue of enforcement, which I will come to. But I do want to pay tribute to them and indeed recognise that they've been also awarded for that work within the department, and rightly so. And it is making genuine and real impact, because sanctions are one of the most powerful tools we have to protect our security and advance our foreign policy, including the areas that have been described today. We impose sanctions to isolate those responsible, restrict their ability to act and change their behaviour, and also to send deterrent and other messages beyond those we target. But of course, they must be focused. They must be enforceable, they must be backed by the right resources, they must be legally sound, they must be backed by absolutely credible evidence, and we maintain the integrity of our regime by the strictest interpretation and the solidity of the evidence underpinning them. And I do want colleagues to understand that, because it's very important to actually the functioning of the regime as a whole. And since this government came in, we set ambitious targets on sanctions, and we've introduced more than 1,000 new sanctions designations against individuals, entities and ships. We've laid 15 new statutory instruments. We've included creating a new regime on irregular migration, which the shadow spokesperson referred to. We've already designated 32 individuals and entities on that. We've played a leading role in the snapback of sanctions on Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programmes, and those are just some of the examples that we show that sanctions are not just symbolic gestures, they are practical tools that are tightly focused and have a meaningful impact. And of course, the UK covers Magnitsky-style sanctions under two regimes, the global human rights regime and the global anti-corruption regime. And under this government, we have delivered over 60 designations under those regimes. In 2025, we sanctioned 29 individuals and entities under the global human rights regime, going after scam centres in Cambodia, targets in Sri Lanka, Georgia, the West Bank, many of the issues and areas that colleagues have raised. We've also delivered 164 sanctions taking actions on human rights violations, war atrocities, gender-based violence. We've imposed sanctions on individuals, entities and organisations responsible for supporting or inciting violence against Palestinian communities in the West Bank. And of course, in June 2025, we sanctioned Israeli government ministers Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich in their personal capacities, responding to their repeated incitement of violence against Palestinian communities. And I mentioned that scam centre package in Cambodia. That package alone froze 20 UK properties worth over £125 million, directly disrupting criminal activity at the heart of London and globally impacting on British citizens on our streets, but also linked to global corruption networks. And of course, in November 2024, under the global anti-corruption regime, we sanctioned 3 notorious kleptocrats who'd siphoned wealth from their countries, along with their enablers, including family and financial fixers. We froze over 150 million in UK assets and sent a strong signal of support on countries like Angola and others. We targeted an illicit gold network centred on a Kenyan-British smuggler who was using corruption to move gold out of southern Africa. And in April 2025, we sanctioned corrupt officials and judges in Georgia and Guatemala and a pro-Russian network in Moldova, exposing their activities and supporting democracy and the rule of law. And of course, Magnitsky sanctions are not our only tool. We have the wider geographic regimes, and just in December, we sanctioned 9 individuals and entities under the Syria regulations for abuses committed under the Assad regime and during last year's coastal violence. So, as I said, we have to ensure that they are robust, legally sound, evidence-based, and stand up to the most robust scrutiny. And I'm sure colleagues will understand why. And of course, Russia has been a highlight for many members today. We have taken concerted action on this front that is making a significant difference. Last year, we sanctioned over 700 individuals, entities and ships under the Russian regime. We were the first G7 country to sanction all 4 Russian oil majors. And then the US also followed suit on that, and that's had a direct impact. Russia's oil revenues have dropped to their lowest levels since the invasion began, and I know that there is strong support across at least the majority of the House on those issues. And I listed off the very many other Magnitsky sanctions designation packages. I'm conscious of the time, and I'm going to try and respond to some of the points that have been raised. I think it's worth making the point, often there's comparisons between the different regimes. We do coordinate very closely with partners, particularly in the European Union and the United States, and indeed Canada and other partners. We try and bring the weight of the world to bear on these issues at crucial times. But I would emphasise to colleagues that the legal basis for our sanctions regimes are different. There are different legal and judicial processes, and that's why there are often differences. And I'd also say there are often differences because of where nexuses of individuals and entities are, where we can have the biggest impact for our sanctions. And sometimes that's what underpins what otherwise appear to be sometimes incongruity between regimes, but we always try to bring them together. The right honourable gentleman mentioned specifically some issues around the Cambodian scam centres and Chen Zi. I obviously emphasised to him that Cambodia arrested Chen Zi and extradited him to China this week, and Cambodia's central bank liquidated Prince Bank on January the 8th. So there's been a very, very significant impact as a result of that package, and obviously the sanctions are only one part of responding to these networks. There are other measures that, of course, countries can choose to take themselves in response to very serious allegations. There's been a lot of questions rightly raised around Sudan and you know the work the government is doing on that issue and the importance the Foreign Secretary, the Minister for Africa, myself and others place on that. And obviously building consensus or ending that horrific war is a core part of the government's diplomatic efforts, and that includes with other regional partners and with the UAE, and the Foreign Secretary is in regular contact with the Emirati Foreign Minister, and also the Prime Minister has spoken with his counterpart, and we will continue to use all necessary means to bring an end to that war in Sudan and the devastating impacts it's having on citizens. There's been many questions, obviously, in relation to Hong Kong, which were raised by a number of colleagues. Of course, we could call on Beijing to repeal Hong Kong's national security law. We are closely monitoring the situation there. And of course, we keep sanctions under close review. And I'm not going to speculate on future designations for obvious reasons. But I know that there are particular cases that have been raised. Jimmy Lai rightly raised. Again, his case remains an utmost priority. Diplomats continue to press for consular access, attended his trial throughout. The Prime Minister has raised his case directly with President Xi, and of course we are in close contact with his family and representatives, and of course we want to make sure that he receives the proper treatment, and deeply concerned about some of the allegations made about his treatment in prison. The case of Ryan Cornelius, and I want to acknowledge the family who've been here today, and indeed Charles Ridley as well. We continue to support their families. The former Foreign Secretary raised their cases with the UAE Foreign Minister last year, and I understand the former Foreign Secretary, Minister Falconer, met with the families in September, and we support their clemency applications, and of course we raise all those and indeed other cases with appropriate authorities at the right time. Jagdish Singh Johal's case was also raised. Of course, we continue to raise serious concerns about that with the Government of India at every possible opportunity. We have not stopped our Myanmar sanctions. Since the coup, we've sanctioned 25 individuals and 39 entities. There were very important concerns raised around Roman Abramovich and the Chelsea club assets. I draw colleagues' attentions to what we've said very clearly on that and the Prime Minister's action on the licence. I do think in relation to the concerns raised regarding the Shadow Attorney General, which were made strongly by colleagues, they stand by themselves. I do think the opposition do have some very serious questions to answer on this. It does seem completely unfathomable to me, as the Prime Minister set out yesterday in Prime Minister's questions, and I think is deeply disappointing. And indeed, lastly, what I will say, Madam Deputy Speaker, is on the question of enforcement, if I may, because I'm conscious there's another debate to come, and I have to let an annual report. So the Honourable Gentleman raises the importance of reporting to Parliament. I can assure him that not only have I been scrutinised in this place many, many times, I've placed a letter actually in the House to the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee and Lord Ricketts in the other place, setting out the full detail of all the work we've done. I am committed to regularly reporting to Parliament on these issues. Indeed, I've met with many members across the House in private meetings to discuss concerns, and I'm absolutely committed to continuing to do that. But on the issue of enforcement, I do think that some of the criticism was somewhat unwarranted. This is an issue I've regularly championed. It's absolutely right. I agree with the principles of what colleagues have said, but I would point out that in November, the NCA announced using the intelligence it gained in Operation Destabilise, it supported international law enforcement partners in seizing $24 million and over €2.6 million from Russian money laundering networks with links to drugs and organised crime. There have been over 128 arrests as a result of that operation alone, with over 25 million seized in cash and cryptocurrency, another issue that's mentioned. OFSI has issued just in 2025 4 major civil monetary penalties totalling over 900,000. I think some of the figures that colleagues have are not quite accurate. And indeed, HMRC on its side concluded a 1.1 million compound settlement for trade sanctions breaches in May. The Shadow Minister asked for figures. I'm happy to write with some further details, but just one example, OTSI has received reports or referrals for 146 potential breaches of sanctions and has a number of investigations underway. I don't want to comment on all of those, but I do want to assure the House that we take all of the considerations that members have raised today very, very seriously. Sanctions are an absolutely important tool, including Magnitsky-related sanctions. We will continue to look at all possibilities. I welcome the challenge, and we will continue to rigorously pursue not only the regimes and the designations, but also, crucially, that enforcement that makes the difference.
Sir Iain Duncan Smith to very quickly wind up.
I will indeed. Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I thank those members from South Dorset, Dewsbury and Battle, Kensington and Bayswater, Macclesfield, Bolton West, who have all made contributions in this debate and for their support in all of this. I just want to, in the winding up, to say that some points that I do want to press the government on. Number one, why not have an annual report? I simply raise that as a question because it would stop us having to bid for a backbench MP day, and who knows, you may even get more people than before. I do raise questions about Sudan and the UAE. The fact is that they are complicit now in the most brutal murders, rapes and everything else. That, coupled together with the holding of a hostage, and I call him a hostage, Ryan Cornelius, 17 years without his family, with them in penury now as a result of it, surely this does give us the opportunity to say, unless you release him, we will put sanctions on your individuals at the bank and elsewhere. That would be certainly very helpful. And the same with Jimmy Lloyd. It is time now for us to say the country that administered Hong Kong, can no longer put up with the trashing of the Sino-British Agreement and of the terrible behaviour over legal systems and the ending of basically English common law in the territory of Hong Kong. These are some of the issues. There are many other issues raised, and I have to say I have the highest regard for him, as he knows, the Minister. We have spoken about this endlessly in different regards, and I take him as a very honest individual. I hope he will take these back to the Foreign Office and say, we've done well, but we could do an awful lot more, and therefore I move the motion.
Yeah. The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to the backbench motion on high street gambling reform, and if I give the benches a few moments to swap over.